humanity. Claim this unloved soul. A 4-ACO DMT and meditation trip report by Random Output. Posted to earwid.org, March 29, 2018. Lately, I've become interested in drug-aided meditation and visualization as a means of achieving insight. My first attempt at this involved a moderately high 200 microgram dose of 1-PLSD combined with CBD, and the effects far exceeded my expectations. I'd expected to spend a while watching the strange, evolving, lysergic geometry as I pondered my problems and fears. Instead, I fully dissociated and spent 75 minutes drifting from one illusory existence to another, experiencing life through the eyes of a stranger and a series of friends. The episode was profound enough that I wished to replicate it, and this led me to the 4 subtryptamines. I first sampled a low to moderate 10mg dose of 4-ACO DMT to see how it differed from the by now familiar lysergamides. I found that the 4-ACO DMT had a much faster onset, with a markedly shorter duration and plateau, and while the visual, tactile and cognitive effects were comparable, if not identical, the tryptamines had a number of novel subjective effects. Surprisingly, potent sedation, appetite suppression, and some short-term memory impairment. Overall, I found these novel effects to be mildly unpleasant, but potentially effective aids to visualization. The sedation and amnesia could make dissociation easier, while the shorter duration means I can take a dose later in the day without it interfering with my sleep. Set and setting. My apartment, early evening, Saturday. Cloudy, cool, but still warm enough that there are a lot of people about. I tried the 4-ACO DMT 3 days ago, so I may still have some residual psychedelic tolerance. It's been 4 hours since I've eaten. Preparation. The drug is dissolved in 80 proof vodka to a 1mg over 1ml strength, stored in a refrigerated glass bottle. 0 hours. I prepare a kind of magic screwdriver. 20ml of my solution, 20mg of the drug, mixed with a similar amount of orange juice over ice. The resulting cocktail tastes no different than one made with ordinary psychedelic-free vodka. I burn a little incense, put on some Bowie, and relax, just like I would any other evening. T plus 20 minutes. I'm feeling first alerts, the most pronounced of which are tactile sensations. There are significant differences between the tactile sensations caused by lysergamides and tryptamines. The former are strong, almost sexual pulses of energy, whereas what I'm feeling now is a gentler, all-encompassing warmth, something like being lowered into a hot bath. I take a bismuth tablet to stave off any potential nausea. T plus 30 hours. Now the open-eye visuals are setting in. The initial visuals are very subtle. Green flecks on the walls, a strange hardness to the shadows, and colourful overlays on objects in my peripheral vision. The best comparison I can make is that of a digital photograph that's been resaved in several different formats and lost some of its colour data. Tactile effects are getting stronger. I'm feeling an odd sensation across my face as well as a tension in the muscles, as though I've been smiling. T plus 45 minutes. Nausea sets in, but it's actually very mild, more so than in my test. More significantly, I'm experiencing some very strange cognitive effects. Every time I shift my attention, from the music to my trip journal for example, it feels like I've actually moved. This one room is more like 4 very similar rooms that are connected by a means that, well, I don't really understand. T plus 1 hour. Since I'm handling the dose pretty well, I decide to add a 5mg booster in preparation for the meditation session. I don't start yet though, as I'm losing control over my emotions. It's absurd what set it off. I read some message on my phone and it triggered an episode of self-hatred. Recently, I've become aware of how many relationships in my life have been strictly transactional, which is a fancy way of saying that most people I've known have been using me to some end. This is something I'm aware of even when I'm sober. Now, with a head full of magic, I'm feeling terribly alone, unloved, and unlovable. T plus 1 hour and 20 minutes. The dimensions of the room keep changing, but I am so inwardly focused that I barely even notice it. Desperate for some kind of human contact, I wheel myself off the love seat and over to the computer, where I attempt to log into the trips at IRC, but my head is so backward that I can't quite manage it. Against my better judgment, I take one more 5mg booster and start the session. The last thing to show up in my notes, in barely legible handwriting, is the phrase, "May God find me somewhere in there, because there might not be anyone else who wants me." The setup for my meditation sessions is not terribly elaborate. My bedroom is darkened as much as possible. It's not pitch black, but it's dark enough with the blinds closed and curtains drawn, especially on a cloudy day. I have a set of noise-cancelling headphones, and a down-tempo 2-hour playlist I've specifically set up for this purpose. T plus unknown hours. The meditation session lasts about 80 minutes. There's no way to keep a timeline of my experiences during this. I have no clue what time it is, and I'm not sure the time would mean anything to me anyway. During this time, I again dissociate, but the experience is much different. The lysergamide-aided session was volatile and immersive, with lots of highly detailed, multi-sensory hallucinations. This experience is far more abstract and emotional. While I do still catch a glimpse of one of those visions, most of them recreated memories from early in my life, they are very fleeting. This session is less seen and more felt, on a level that's awe-inducing. I should at least try and explain what I see on the inside of my eyelids. Most of the time, it's void. Not even blackness, but absolute nothingness. Like I've lost even the concept of vision itself. Occasionally though, I do see some constructs floating in the abyss. Usually, these are either two-dimensional smears of colour or massive radiant pillars, but they tend to disintegrate as soon as I try to observe them. More rarely, I see a female face that I've seen a few times while under the effects of psychedelics. While there's not much to see in the void, there is plenty to hear. I frequently hear voices over the sound of the music. The loudest one, a deep male voice, announces his surrender to God and beseeches me to submit as well. Obeying his orders, I relax and feel my body fade into non-existence. I can now hear two more voices. A female voice belonging, I assume, to the face I've been seeing, that taunts and challenges me, and a very faint male voice that seems to be trying to give me some information of sorts. When the voices feel silent, my consciousness flows with the music, and I can almost see the pressure wave floating in the void before me. I suppose this is what they call ego death. But at no point do I forget where I am, or the fact that I'm under the influence of a drug. Nevertheless, I do begin to view my actual life as a fiction. I'm observing my own existence from somewhere in space, and I have no immediate desire to return. Finally, it dawns on me what this is. Death. True oblivion. I've left my body and been taken up to a very strange sort of heaven. At first I found myself begging whatever higher power is in charge of this place to let me stay. But when I tried to let go of that fiction, I found myself brought to tears at the thought of all those people still on Earth. It's time to come back. T plus 2 hours and 40 minutes. I am unbelievably disoriented as I return to reality. It takes a few minutes to grasp what time it is, and when I do, it doesn't feel right. Surely it's been more than 3 hours since I took the initial dose. But then again, the clock doesn't lie. I'm not hungry at all, but I understand that I should eat. So, I heat up a slice of pizza I picked up earlier in the day. It's fantastic. Everything's fantastic. I've never really been as happy to be alive. T plus 3 hours. While I may have experienced some kind of catharsis, I'm still not back to normal. Mentally, I feel somewhat detached from reality, a sensation similar to what I felt the day after my first full 1p LSD experience. Physically, I am enervated, so weak that I can barely move. I can't do much of anything but lie on the love seat until about T plus 5 hours, when I finally regain the strength to start writing. Aftermath. Even once my strength returns, I'm still too tired to do anything productive, so I go to bed early. I quickly drift into a sleep filled with dreams that are vivid, but otherwise not all that unusual. I still feel slightly off centre when I wake up, but I guess I'm once again functional. Conclusion. I was curious about tryptamines, and this answered some questions I had. Compared to lysergamides, tryptamines like 4-ACO-DMT are a lot more emotional for good or ill. There's no general mood lift here, and that can make for a very rough ride if things start to go south. On the other hand, that same effect can make them a lot more cathartic for the user willing to ride it out. 1p LSD is a lot more recreational, more fun, and that extended to the meditation session I had with it. 4-ACO DMT is a little scary, but that makes it potentially more rewarding. That said, I doubt I'll try this again, and certainly not anytime soon. Smile. This is quite a ride. A 4-ACO DMT and 2CB trip report by Neurotic Optician, posted at earwood.org, January 11th, 2012. Hello, I'm going to attempt to write about my most recent psychedelic journey, though these words are just a shade of the experience and will be brief when compared to the expansive nature of the trip itself. Many things about the night are going to be completely left out, but this should give you some insight into my experience. I suppose I'll start out with some background. This was my second experience of 4-ACO DMT and my first combination of the drug. My first experience, 40 milligrams, was, well, interesting, I'll say. While not overwhelming, I tend to have a high tolerance to psychs. Most of the night was defined by confronting problems that I had been ignoring or perhaps lying to myself about. So, most of that experience was not necessarily pleasant, despite how rewarding it ultimately proved to be. Months later, I decide I will revisit this chem and bring along a good buddy 2CB as well, hoping for a more pleasant yet equally profound trip. An ice storm rolls through Texas. Class is cancelled, so my Thursday night is now free, and it is the day after my roommate and lifelong friend's birthday. He wants to trip on 2CB, and I decide to join in along with 4ACs. Spontaneous trips are always the best in my experience. It's 10:30 PM and I parachute 50 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT and 80 milligrams of 2CB at the same time on a fairly empty stomach. I begin to load a bowl to smoke once we start coming up, which should be in the next hour or so. Wait, wait, it can't be. It's only been 5, maybe 10 minutes. Okay, wow, it's been 15 minutes and I'm now coming up hard. What did I get myself into? I close my eyes and I see visuals more complex than anything I've ever experienced before. Vast fields of swirling patterns, columns extending in uniform to infinity, and then collapsing on themselves, colours stretching and splashing, caverns of fantastic geometric patterns dancing and rearranging. It's been just 20 minutes. I've never come up this fast from a drug taken orally before. My mind begins to race and I feel unable to focus my attention on any one thing for very long, whether it's the music or my increasingly fantastic visuals. I'm bouncing from place to place inside my head. While coming up, I'm currently unable to sit back, carefree, and simply delight in my senses I am often able to on PEAs. This trip was unavoidably deeper than that. I do remember looking at my roommate around the 30-minute mark and saying, "Man, this shit is deep." He was only on 2CB and was just starting to feel it, while I already had begun to lose my connection to reality, and time would warp substantially more from now on. At some point I open my eyes and stare at the ceiling. The popcorn texture finish of my ceiling begins to scramble and shift, sometimes in random chaos, sometimes in unison. I feel myself falling into or through my couch. I'm dissolving. I feel I may have just died and now my atoms are redispersing into the universe. But I cannot be sure, as my memories are dissolving as well. I know I'm losing myself, my reality, and I feel my memories even fading into oblivion as well. I am being stripped of all points of reference until all that remains is my essential soul. So, obviously, here's where things begin to get difficult to explain. I'm only my essential essence. I cannot remember who I was, and I'm largely disconnected from my thoughts. While my emotions are still very strong, I'm confused and even a little scared. I'm aware that I have lost something, and I no longer have any points of reference to help me understand myself and my environment. And now, I am just me, and in that moment, seemingly floating between dimensions. I begin to sense that I am not alone in my headspace, and then I feel these negative energies swirl around me, beginning to attack and grate at my soul. I believe my first experience of 4ACs helped prepare me for this moment. Anyways, I felt crowded by these negative energies attacking and provoking me. I'm confused and scared, and then the most wonderful thing happened. I smiled. It is bringing tears to my eyes just remembering this moment. I smiled and I suddenly felt joy bursting from my soul. The negative energies which seemed poised to overwhelm me now fade, and in its place what emerges is so profound I will and cannot put into words. They smile and laugh with me and basically tell me, well done. It was a test, and I passed. I laugh and cry from joy, from appreciation. Life became a river, and I sat at the bottom of its waterfall and let it wash over me. I was so very happy. It is strange describing something I felt and understood so completely, yet there were no accompanying visuals or auditory hallucinations to necessarily pinpoint. I just completely felt the experience. I had limited control over the direction and coherence of my thoughts during this period. I was mainly just working with emotions. I felt a supremely satisfying connection with something larger than myself, and I really felt like 4-ACO DMT was not only a vessel to that connection, but a guide to understanding it. I saw the mystical nature of the tryptamine finally, and I'm truly in awe. 2CB seemed to add a more pleasant body load than from what I remember of 4ACs alone, and certainly amped up the visuals, but the 4-ACO DMT was definitely the star of the night. I was peaking for about 4 hours, with a slow come down of about 4 to 5. When we started coming down, we watched the most recent season of Curb Your Enthusiasm with the Seinfeld reunion story arc in its entirety. I feel such a connection to Larry David, Jerry Seinfeld, and their nihilistic brand of comedy, especially when tripping. It's truly hard to convey. Well, that's all I really have to say at the moment. I hope you enjoyed the read.
An Inert God Stuck in Time. A 4-ACO DMT Trip Report by McDoss. Posted to earwid.org May 15, 2019. 4-ACO DMT was my favourite psychedelic, I decided. It was easy to find, it was easy to ingest, and the effects set in noticeably faster than LSD or mushrooms. It was possible I preferred mushrooms, but 4-ACO seemed very similar, and to be honest, I kind of liked the idea of being a psychonotic hipster, taking a weird research chemical that many people have never heard of. I'd tripped about 15 times before this. 4 of those times were on 4-ACO, and I was feeling confident with this one. Through a few very bad experiences, both by myself and with friends, I had to learn to respect and to always trip in a safe environment. I lived with a couple of roommates in a large home, and over time, I'd prepared my corner of the house to be as cosy and trip-friendly as possible. Feeling prepared and knowledgeable, I weighed out 55 milligrams of 4-ACO on a lab quality scale, which I then deposited into 2 cellulose capsules. I also measured out a few more capsules for future use as well. I knew how strong this stuff was, but I'd taken 35 milligrams just a few weeks earlier, and I wanted to go a level or 2 further with this trip. I knew this would be the deepest I had ever gone, and I was ready for it. I pressed start on my phone timer, a ritual of mine to keep myself grounded during the trip. Imagine my surprise then, when 2 hours and 30 minutes later, I was stone cold sober. I felt a come up, yeah, but I never peaked. At around the 60-minute mark, I spent some time in bed and felt like I was on the way up, but when I got out of bed, an hour later I realised I wasn't actually tripping. I was frustrated and disappointed. I decided to give it another 30 minutes at least to see what happened. I ate some food during this time, but all 30 of those minutes were spent wondering why I wasn't tripping, despite taking a very large dose of a strong psychedelic that was only 3 weeks old. So at the 2 hours and 30 minute mark, I pulled out the extra capsules I filled earlier. I grabbed 30 milligrams, downed it with a glass of water, and put the rest back. Then, I sat in front of my computer and watched some YouTube videos while I waited to see if anything would happen. 40 minutes after my 3rd capsule, something was definitely happening. Like all of my prior trips, it started with noticing random things around me that never caught my attention while sober. I felt relieved that I was finally tripping, and I was very happy with my decision to take that 3rd pill. I decided to put on some music to keep the positive vibes going. One of the songs that came on had a female singer, and I was completely taken in by her voice. All I wanted was to hear her speak and sing. I realised I was sexually attracted to her voice. I'd had this thought on other trips, so it wasn't particularly new or surprising, but I wondered how normal it was. Then, I realised that some inflections of her voice made her sound exactly like my long-time girlfriend, whose name was Elle, and that voice had probably been a big part of my attraction to my girlfriend all this time. During this period, I gagged a few times. I always gag a little bit on the come up for psychedelics, so this was nothing alarming. I thought about how tragic it was that I always felt a little sick at some point during my trips, but that ironically, the gags were so familiar at this point that they were almost comforting. I wouldn't normally mention this, but it will be relevant later. I want to point out that no point during the come up did I even consider that I had really taken the full 85 milligrams I had ingested. In my mind, there was no way in hell those 55 milligrams were ever going to hit me with full force. I guessed that the total amount I had taken would probably feel closer to 35 milligrams. I didn't have an explanation for why, but I fully believed that the 4-ACO had lost much of its potency. At about the 3 hours and 45 minute mark from the first dose, I started to feel a little overwhelmed. I realised the trip was becoming very strong, and I felt the need to lie down, but I didn't exactly want to go back to my bed. I searched Google for extremely relaxing music, and clicked on a video that showed a beach and played soft ambient music with the sound of waves in the background. Then I wrapped myself in an extremely soft blanket that Elle bought me, and tried to relax. I dropped to the ground and squirmed around in the blanket, feeling its softness on my skin. I felt extremely comfortable, and I started to feel emotional. I felt like I was a pathetic human being, but that I was so lucky to have the people around me love me as much as they did. I started to feel extremely grateful to Elle, and I started saying, "I love you, Elle," over and over out loud while squirming in the blanket. Her caring and tenderness were allowing me to feel that moment of bliss. All of a sudden though, I felt very alone. See, Elle and I lived in different parts of the country, and it had been a very long time since I'd seen her. In fact, none of my loved ones lived near me anymore. And this realisation hit me very hard. I felt like an idiot, utterly alone, writhing on the dirty floor of his room because he took too many drugs. This lack of social interaction made me feel like I was barely human. At this time, I started to feel sick. I felt like I needed to gag again. I started to worry that maybe I wasn't even human. Maybe I was just a dumb animal who accidentally ate the wrong thing. Did I even take drugs? Maybe this wasn't even a trip. I started dry heaving on the ground by now, and I felt very sick. I would always gag on the come up, but I never gagged during the peak, so this sort of scared me. Maybe I actually was sick. Maybe I was very sick. I started to dread that something was very wrong. I felt flashes of hot and cold, like I had a fever. I knew that people could hallucinate with very high fevers, and I suddenly became very convinced that I might be dying. I got so sick and had such a high fever that my brain was malfunctioning. I could actually die right now. The waves from the music sounded like they came from all around me, and I realised I was on the shores of death. I was actually dying. I was definitely going to die any minute now. If I didn't get to hospital, I was going to die. But I was completely incapable of using my phone and calling for help. I wanted to be okay with dying, but I couldn't convince myself that it was okay at all. I had too many loose ends in my life. I needed to marry Elle and live life together with her before I died. I couldn't just leave her alone. She'd be absolutely devastated if I died right now. But that's when I realised I couldn't remember what Elle looked like. In fact, I couldn't perceive or remember the world around me at all. I couldn't remember what my brother looked like, or my mother, or even the room I was in. I couldn't remember the last time I saw any of it. All of my memories felt very fake. Everything I could imagine felt like a far-off dream that all this time I had forgotten to question. I realised that I had never lived at all, not even a single moment of my life. I could remember waking up from sleep and going to sleep, but nothing in between felt real. Everything felt so dreamlike. like the twilight as you lie in bed at night waiting to fall asleep. Had I ever actually slept? Was anything real? Did I spend my entire life in a dreamy state, recalling false memories, waiting for a sleep that would never come? I then had the very strong sense that time and reality were not real. I was a cosmic being, trapped in the fabric of the universe like a single puzzle piece. Nothing had ever happened. It was all in my mind. Reality itself was only ever what I imagined it to be. All of the pain and suffering in the world didn't exist. I just imagined it, which caused it to exist in my mind. Because of this, in a very real sense, I caused all the pain and suffering in the world. I could stop it, if only I could avoid thinking about it. But avoiding thinking of it meant actually thinking of it, so I was stuck in this sort of loop. In fact, everything was a loop, and I existed in this state for eternity, trapped in looping memories from my own mind, but there was no future to speak of. There would never be new memories made. The very few things I remembered were all there was. The universe was hopeless and empty. Elle did not exist. No one existed. I was absolutely, completely alone. I tried very hard to come to terms with this, but I just couldn't. I felt this unbearable loneliness. I felt like I'd always lived and always would live, completely inert, stuck in time. Nothing would ever change. I felt it was possible that I was literally in hell. Perhaps there were other celestial beings who actually had it figured out. They had figured out how to live without time. I couldn't perceive them, because I could perceive nothing other than my own little pocket of dimensional space. I was utterly irrelevant and doomed. I wanted to die, and I wanted everything to stop. During this time, I had a brief moment of clarity. I realised for a moment that I did have memories of taking drugs, and that if nothing else, I might be able to go back to my illusion of a life once the drugs wore off. I remembered that I'd started a timer on my phone. I didn't feel like I could understand the timer if I looked at it, but I wanted to see it to prove to me that the trip had progressed. I wanted proof that time had moved. I wanted proof that this would end. So with a lot of effort, I managed to pull up the clock app on my phone and clicked over to the stopwatch tab. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. On some level, I knew I'd stupidly reset the timer at some point, but in this moment during the trip, my mind filled to the brim with despair. It was the deepest, darkest, blackest place I have ever been to in my entire life. I had no proof that time had ever moved. Elle was not real. Nothing was real. I was stuck. I laid there on the floor, filled with self-pity and hopelessness, for what felt like hours. Then, suddenly, I felt like maybe I wasn't actually about to die. I felt like I could sit up, and so I did. I managed to stand up, still wrapped in my soft blanket, and I stumbled to the bathroom. I peed in the toilet, but it felt wrong. It was like I was wetting my bed. I had flashes of hope that the trip was over, but then I looked around me and saw the world shifting and morphing, and I realised I shouldn't get so excited, because I was still tripping very hard. Except, there was a world around me, and it was real. Reality was real. The realisation that reality was real washed over me like the waves of a warm bath. I looked around me and realised that I didn't understand anything at all. I couldn't tell if it was night or day. I couldn't tell what time it was. And I didn't know what day of the week it was either. But I knew that all of those things were real, and that I'd be able to know them eventually. I became convinced I was a literal god, and if I wanted something, I could just will it to be. It was night, and I wanted it to be morning. So I willed it to be morning, and it worked. Well, that's how I felt at the time. Obviously I couldn't actually change night into day, really. I walked around my apartment willing things to be true, and each time I willed it, I got the strong feeling I was successful. Eventually, I felt well enough to leave my room, and I went to rest on the living room couch. I realised I wasn't a god, and I laughed at how silly it was to believe that. I still didn't understand time or numbers, so I just laid there, waiting for my brain to catch up while I basked in absolute contentness. Nothing mattered, except that I wasn't a trapped celestial being anymore, and that Elle actually existed. She was real. Of course she was real. She was real, and I was going to be okay. In the days after the trip, I felt grounded and peaceful. I did not take away any big lessons from the trip, but I felt very emotionally stable and clear of mind. I called Elle, told her about the trip, and told her I loved her. After talking with some friends and others online, the operating theory is that at least one of the capsules took longer than usual to dissolve, and so I got hit with most of the 85 milligrams after I took the third pill. In retrospect, the trip went way better than it had any right to. Because I was calm for the entire come-up and my room was comfortable, I went through the worst of it without becoming agitated or scared. Even though I'd done something risky and a little irresponsible, I felt appreciative to my sober self for taking my past experiences into account and creating a good trip environment. I wouldn't take that much 4-ACO again on purpose, but in the end, it was an extremely beneficial and somewhat spiritual experience for me.
A 200mg 4-ACO DMT trip report, taken from the Vivec Discord. I'd found some 4-ACO DMT online, and I wanted to try it. I asked my neighbour at my university about it, and to my surprise, he had some, and gave it to me. When I weighed the whole thing, it came to a 2.00. For some reason, in my mind, I thought the entire thing was 20mg, rather than 200. I consumed the whole amount, and within 15 to 20 minutes of consuming this, I could already see faces outlined on trees. I just had to remind myself to let the trip happen, as I was well aware the worst thing to do on a trip is to fight the experience, whatever it is. I was walking down this long road of trees on each side between driveways, and from walking, my vision was making me feel seasick. The movement of my head alone was causing me to feel dizzy. I still had no idea I'd consumed so much of this drug and just stopped for a second, and continued on towards this park. When I got into the park, a dog came up to me, so I reached down to stroke it. After stroking it for a few seconds, the communication me and the dog were having was incredibly vivid, and so I stopped and decided to just walk away. As I'm now leaving this park, I passed by some people who were speaking in sim character language. As I listened closely, I realised they were actually speaking English, but as I was so dissociated, to me it sounded like random gibberish. At this point, I was laughing at their silly-sounding language, when I had this thought in my head that they could be talking about something very important and serious to them, and I'm laughing at it. I then realised I couldn't even tell if they had noticed me laughing or if they were talking to me or not. I decided to speed up my walk and just make my way towards this new location I wanted to get to. Walking down the road, I sat at a bus stop as I was becoming extremely exhausted by walking. I sat down and my entire vision for a split second faded into swirling patterns and colours. At this point, I realised I needed to get back home. I was outside alone and my entire vision was just morphed into nothingness. At this point, I believe my ego was already gone, but I truly had no concept to question the intensity of the experience at any point, as before I could even feel myself dying, I had already become fully invested in letting this trip play out and being stuck in it until it ends. Whilst walking back, I was looking in the distance at these very strange brown thick lines that were later out in my vision. I was trying to make out what they were, but everything else was just a normal road of cars and people. Finally, I got back into my tiny university accommodation, which was not a good idea, but I couldn't be outside in this state I was in. The time was about 5 o'clock, and I knew some friends I had would be coming at 6. Funnily enough, my other friend was spending time with his girlfriend, and for some strange reason I could just not disturb them even when this trip got quickly dangerous. I still had no intention to disturb them, and they were not even a possibility to help me in my mind. This state of delirium I have never experienced before this or since, where logically I'm going round in spirals, and you will see what I mean very soon. This is the part of the trip that I find very difficult to explain in chronological order. Some of these things seem to have happened after something I knew had happened before, and well, that is the best way I can describe this experience. I'm not sure of the experience before purgatory. However, I know I experienced a split second of bliss, the most amazing experience possible, before the worst experience possible. But before that, I'm going to try and order the other experiences I had in this time. They did not seem to happen at this time of the trip, however there is no other time in the trip to put them down. One experience was sharing a consciousness with another entity. This entity was almost like a godly thing, however it was not God, it was evil. My sole purpose of existing was an expense to be mocked and laughed at while I suffered. Me and this entity would communicate, however we both shared the same exact thoughts, so how we were communicating is beyond me, but we were. I was showed how my traumatic birth was the reason I was the way I was. I had to relive this birth. At the time of this, I was actually on the phone to a friend who was not anywhere near me back in Essex. I was in university about 3 hours away. He was editing a music video, and as he would go back and forth over a clip, I could hear me doing this on the phone. It would become my mum who was creating me, perfecting me, sitting in her womb, waiting to be born. I felt so impatient and just wanted to be born, but then I realised how beautiful it was to see myself be created, and the comfort of being there. Eventually, I was born, and this was very funny looking back, as I could not even put on my t-shirt. I'm not actually sure when I took it off, but I remember attempting to put it on, and every time I would move the holes around to find the head hole, I managed to also stick my head into the sleeve. I must have ruined this t-shirt. Eventually, I just threw the thing on the floor, feeling so energised and amazed to be alive, and at one point I considered leaving my room to go to the toilet. I remember opening it and putting my hands in the frame to pull my head around the corner, with the insane looking grin on my face, which I then jumped back into my room, laughing at the idea of someone coming around the corridor and seeing my face. Before I knew it, I had then to experience my actual birth. I had to confront it and deal with it. This was scary. I heard the sound of a male voice, which I knew was a doctor, and beeps from a machine. This terrified me. I had to experience the traumatic birth I went through. I don't remember much of it. At some point, I was in purgatory. This was a place where time stood still, but I guess I thought of myself as someone who could somehow best the delusion of the trip. At this point, I had completely forgotten my friends were home. I remember looking at the time, and it was 8:02. I knew it. I knew I watched a 20-minute video. I knew I waited for it to end and then checked the time, that time would have to change. I also set a timer. Now, when the timer went off, I don't know, but I'm sure it went off multiple times, and I just had no idea what it was. I remembered watching the video, and when it ended, I checked the time, and it was 8:22. Needless to say, I was shocked. How could it still be 8 o'clock, I thought? I had no concept of minutes when I was checking the time, but I had the concept of minutes to know if I watched a 20-minute video, that time would have to change. This is the state of delirium I had achieved, and it went on. After doing this over and over for shorter videos, I started to really get worried I was stuck here forever. Suddenly I got visions of taking a knife and sticking it into my stomach, as this was the only way to escape the trip. Something in me knew this was wrong though. This insane pull towards surviving was deeply embedded in my subconscious. I would lay down on my bed, only to become irritable and say, fuck it. I was about to get up and do it. I would thrust myself back down into the bed as hard as possible as I thought in a loop, with my indecisive mind. Somewhere at some point, I thought maybe I should just call an ambulance as this was getting dangerous, when I suddenly remembered that my friend had been home for at least 2 hours. I called them straight away. Luckily for me, they actually knew about shrooms. I've never really discussed psychedelics with them before, and I had no idea how they'd imagine it would be, but they did know what shrooms did, so that was great. One came to my house to escort me back to theirs, while the other stayed on the phone. During this phone call, I had this thought that maybe this entire call was a hallucination, and I haven't actually answered the phone at all. I said into the phone, "X isn't coming, are they?" The voice on the phone, very sinisterly of my other friend's voice, said, "No." Slowly, I let the phone fall from my ear, as I came to terms with the fact I really had to do myself. Then, I heard my name being called from the phone. I instantly pulled it back to my ear to hear their voice asking if I was okay. "Are they coming?" I said again. The person said yes. Soon my friend came through my door and I gave him a massive hug. I then checked the time, and it was dead on 9. I was extremely happy about this, my friend probably thinking I was insane, but I didn't care. The fact I now had someone I could trust to know I was tripping, that wouldn't call an ambulance or the police, was such a massive relief. I felt so much better. Back at their flat, everything was alive, but to be honest, I didn't care. The TV started talking to me at one point, but in all honesty, I had more important things to be thinking about. Into the Abyss on 4ACO DMT. A trip report by Lilfoot, posted to earwid.org August 27th, 2010. Day 1. It began one morning when a friend and I were on our way back from a party the night before. I had a milligram scale and a fresh bag full of 500 milligrams of 4ACO DMT that I was waiting to crack into once we got home. My previous drug experiences include 4ACO DMT itself, as well as most of the 2C series, LSD, mushrooms, AMT, DMT, DPT, 5-MeO-DALT, MDMA repeatedly to the point of exhaustion, and ketamine, PCP, marijuana, and the usual dissociatives, as well as a handful of opiates, benzos, and other pharmies. But none of them, aside from DPT perhaps, prepared me for this experience that I'm going to talk about. About 10 minutes from home, we heard a siren and saw lights flashing in our rear view. My friend, let's call him John, has zero experience as far as dealing with law enforcement officers, so he becomes instantly nervous. I had the bag of 4ACO DMT in my wallet and the milligram scale beneath my seat. We pulled over, and after telling us that his inspection sticker was out of date, the cop asked John to step out of the vehicle. A couple minutes later, he came back and informed me that John was acting sketchy and was refusing to talk to him or answer any questions at all. He told me that as a result of my friend's actions, or inactions really, they were going to call a K9 unit, and that I should sit tight where I was. In total fight-or-flight mode, I realised that I sure as hell didn't want to go to jail, and even if 4ACO DMT is technically legal at this point in time, I didn't want to take any chances. So in one quick, throat-scraping motion, I swallowed the entire Ziploc baggie full of this very potent tryptamine. We waited and waited and waited for the K9 unit to appear, and the entire time I sat on the curb wondering if I was about to start blowing up right here in front of half of my local PD and just start freaking out on all this stuff. Fortunately, the K9 unit came and went, alerting on nothing, so we were free to go. Immediately, once I re-entered the car, I told John that I needed to puke right now. He didn't believe me when I told him I swallowed the bag at first, but after I informed him of just how serious the situation was, we raced to the closest Kroger, where I spent close to 30 minutes blowing hot bile out my nose just trying to get the bag to come up. No dice. I met my friend outside and told him we needed to get to the ER, and fast. I still wasn't tripping, so I was thankful for that much. But the nurses in the ER basically gave me 2 cups of charcoal and told me there wasn't jack shit they could do, but that I'd most likely pass the bag whole. I took their word for it and went home. Day 2. Summer Slaughter, a big death metal show that was in town at the time. I was super pumped and was tagging along with my other friend, let's call him James. It was fairly uneventful. I noticed that I had yet to pass the bag, but after smoking a blunt in the crowd, I noticed that I felt a little bit more than just stoned. My stomach was in some sort of intense pain, but I shrugged it off and tried to just stay focused on the music. Towards the end of the night, I ended up just sitting on the ground, waiting for it all to be over. I was so incredibly confused, but still thought it was just because I hadn't smoked that much good bud in a long time. We left eventually, and I felt better on the ride home, if not still a little bit foggy. I slammed through a Steel Reserve, Black Label of course, at James's, before I had to ride back to my place. I was feeling very tired and strange, although still not enough for me to suspect the bag had leaked. I told all my friends the story, and they all agreed that it would be pretty gross if I still tried to move any of the chemical once it was released from my body, and we laughed about it all, and I went home. That night, as I lay in bed ready to fall asleep, my thoughts were getting deeper and deeper. I still had no suspicions that it was anything but a heavy drunkenness and being completely pooped from the long day. Day 3. I woke up repeatedly throughout the night, passing in and out of the strangest, most vivid dream I have ever had. It involved multiple levels of lucid dreaming, an insane sex frenzy, as well as time control, reptilian consciousness, and plenty of other super weird, ultra psychedelic stuff. I may actually attempt very low dosages of 4-ACO DMT before bedtime someday, as this was perhaps one of the most interesting parts of the entire experience. When I woke up for good, my body felt light and airy, and it was difficult to read. I figured it was just because my dream was so weird that I was somehow still not totally awake, but the longer I was up, the odder I felt. A friend came over, and I couldn't recognise his face after even an hour of talking, and still had no idea who he was until my sister said his name. I floated through my house, gradually going deeper and deeper into a state of pure oddness. I wondered multiple times if, due to the multi-layered nature of my dream, I was still maybe just dreaming, since it didn't feel much different from a dream at all. And then, about halfway through the day, I felt myself slowly rising in an unmistakable fashion. That's when I knew what had happened. In my last few sober moments, I hopped onto a well-known harm reduction forum that spent quite a bit of time lurking on, and posted my first thread ever, asking whether or not I should go to the ER. Even though I knew how potentially life-threatening the situation could be, I was experiencing huge rushes of euphoria, where I couldn't help but burst out laughing. Things began to wave and churn in my vision, and come unhinged at the edges. In the last wave of near sobriety, before things really began to start shifting, I called my girlfriend and told her to please come pick me up and help me get to the hospital. She had to be at work, but she promised me that her older sister would be there soon to help me out. But this is where things get a little fuzzy. I remember laying in bed, with thousands of feelings beginning to wash over me, each one begging for attention, like my mind was being tugged at from every direction possible. The pull became harder with every passing moment, and walking got a lot harder. In a move that surprised even me, I turned off all the lights in my house, put on some clean clothes, and put water and dog food in my dog's bowl before kissing him goodbye. A part of me, even with as far gone as I was already, understood very well that this might be the last time I would ever get to do these daily routines I once thought of as minor annoyances. I felt calm and at peace, even as my sense of self was beginning to dissolve completely. I vaguely remember my girlfriend's sister, let's call her Sarah, helping me outside and into her car. I remember feeling like we were moving very fast on the way to the ER, and once we got there, it was nearly impossible for me to communicate. I told the triage that I had a bag of drugs that might hurt me inside of me, and it was opening up. She told me to fill out some forms, which just looked like ancient hieroglyphs to me. Sarah obviously realised that this was impossible, and asked the nurse to please see me now while she tried to fill them out, which she obliged to. At this point for me, the walls were turning into portals and three-dimensional spirals were popping out of them towards me from every direction. The next thing I remember it's having my blood pressure checked, and then sitting on a bed in a room that looked and felt like it was entirely outside. The floor was grass, and I could even feel it. After this point, I must have laid down, because the rest is completely impossible for me to describe. There was no entity contact, there was no living millions of lives that you hear on psychedelics. There was just simply me sitting in the light of God, and then becoming it. I experienced many very personal visions that I have no wish to include here for a variety of reasons, but every single one of them shook me to the core, and it still does when I remember them. I experienced becoming old and becoming young and becoming old again, and throughout it all, I was never scared or anxious for a single moment. In fact, it felt like coming home, like the most intense and prolonged deja vu you could ever imagine. I had seen and done everything here before, as I would again and again and again, for all of eternity. It was simply the act of doing at its simplest. Every action the same action, every intention the same intention, every outcome the same outcome. It was completely beautiful. And, to top it off, I survived. According to Sarah, my blood pressure was fine, as well as my pulse, which was a little fast, but I was breathing normally. And she said at some points I even began breathing in through my nose and out from my mouth, which I thought was really interesting. Apparently I just laid there with my eyes closed, almost completely unresponsive. I don't know how long it took me to come down from that place, but when I did, it happened instantly. And suddenly, I was sober again. Completely. They released me, and prescribed me a huge jug of something that's supposed to make me shit a lot to try and clean out my guts. I smoked a cigarette, and we picked up my prescription from the drugstore, where I felt entirely normal. Although, Sarah later informed me that I was being a total creep. Something I don't actually doubt. I had her drop me off at a friend's house, where I recovered some more before he took me home that night. And at that point, I was much closer to normal everyday thinking, although still a little off. Well, more than a little, I guess. I posted some about my experience and popped 2 Benadryls and just passed out cold with my puppy on my chest. Day 4, present time. Heavy afterglow, visual effects still persisting. I catch myself in some thought loops here and there, and still sometimes have glimmers of synesthesia. My thinking has tended towards the mystical, to say the least. A medium dose 5-MeO adult trip and a low dose MDMA trip have helped me to reintegrate some of the experience that I went through. I have a newfound appreciation for sobriety, and have decided to begin a new diet and exercise regime, in light of how much I found myself missing my body when I became detached from it. In a way, I realised how much I'd hated my body before the experience, and how much I value it now. Not in a vain way, but in that it's mine and will always be mine, and I need to take pride in it. I've begun reintroducing myself to all the people I am closest with in my life, and I'm loving every second of it. Let me get this straight though, I am in no way advocating taking this huge of a dose. I had a positive experience despite everything, but I think that I may have only ingested half of the actual dose I took, possibly even less due to charcoal absorption, as well as destruction by heat, acid moisture, and a rapid tolerance climb from the time it leaked, which I'm now guessing was sometime during day 2. I doubt I will ever take anything over 50 milligrams again, if even that.
After reading that magic mushrooms and psychedelics in general can be used to successfully treat depression, I've been trying to trip for quite some time now, but being unable to find mushrooms or acid, let alone DMT in my town, almost made me give up on my quest. Until I knew of 4-ACO DMT, I had ordered 100 milligrams of this wonderful chemical online, and yesterday it finally came in the mail. I had only one goal in mind: to achieve ego death. I know that psychedelics need to be dosed relative to body weight / mass, and being a 6'3", 230 pound guy made my choice clear. I needed to go for broke and take all 100 milligrams in one dose. Earwid note: 100 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT is considered an extremely high dose. See 4-ACO DMT dose chart. So yeah, basically don't be doing this at home, kids. I knew it was going to be intense, but nothing even close to what I experienced last night. I am, and always have been, a very spiritual person, so I was pretty sure that wherever this trip would take me, it would be an amazing experience. I poured the extremely fine fumarate powder in a glass, added lemonade, and stirred for about a minute, until the white powder was completely dissolved. I also ate some almonds and a bit of dark chocolate, just because I didn't want to have an empty stomach. I had a little bit of some decent weed as well, to ease the anticipation and anxiety, so I took a few hits of my joint, drank the lemonade and waited. After 30 minutes, started having some mild visuals, mostly in the form of patterns and trailings, but nothing grand. After 45 minutes, I could tell that my vision had already been greatly enhanced, more specifically my peripheral vision. I could see everything in great detail, and objects started to show a light blue, almost neon-like halo around them. The typing on my computer screen seemed to be in 3D, and the pictures looked much more vibrant than usual, always with a light blue, near neon cast. My hearing was also very precise. I put on Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here, and I could easily hear everything that was being played, sung, spoken in that album. After 1.5 hours into the trip, I decided to get off the computer and go lay on the couch, because my legs and arms had simply stopped working properly. This is when things got real. I started feeling more and more relaxed. My visuals had gotten much more complex and beautiful. I started seeing what looked like columns and arches in a very bright purple bluish colour, expanding forever in every direction by means of fractal growth. My breathing slowed down to maybe 10 or less breaths per minute. Although this is just an estimate, time had begun to lose all meaning. I then realised that time is just something that humans have created. We're the only ones who care about time. Somehow, I felt as if I already knew that, but everyday reality had hidden that fact from me. This made me sad, but I understood that there is a reason for that. At this point, my body was shaking, much like when having an after-pee tremor. A feeling of pure, untainted, infinite love came over me. This incredible feeling of love and simple and pure joy made me gasp repeatedly, like when we're hit with really cold water. I closed my eyes, relaxed even more, let out a huge yawn, and then I left my body. I was no longer me. I was everything that ever was or ever will be, and it's always been like that. I received lots of information on how things work and why everything is the way it is. I understood that nothing is inherently good nor evil. Again, I felt as if I already knew that, but these facts of universal truth are kept hidden away from us while in human form. That's what I got out of it anyway. My soul is drifting in and out of my body, non-stop, almost as if being playful, and I am just basking in the most perfect joy I have ever felt. Yes, my soul, or consciousness if you prefer, would come back to my body every so often, and every time this happened, I would feel something like an orgasm, complete with a gasp and everything, only 1,000 times stronger and without any sexual connotation. My soul has no sexual identity, nor agenda. The true me is pure energy, the same energy that makes up absolutely everything in the universe. While on the couch, my soul left my body at least 5 times. My soul would stay in my body for a few moments, and then I would yawn and it would leave again, only to show me more and more things, like experiencing life from everybody's perspective. I could recall any past experience from my current life, like say an argument or conversation with a person or a group of people, and I could replay the same conversation from other person's point of view, and I could switch from one person's point of view to another, by just thinking of it. I found this to be very pleasant, and I understood that it is only logical to be able to do this, since I am part of everything, and everything is a part of me. At this point I thought my trip was peaking, and things would only get smoother from here on. Wrong. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't work. I felt as if I needed to learn how to walk again. While I was clumsily attempting to walk, I could feel that I was not 100% in my body. Kinda hard to explain now, but I felt as if I was floating above my body. I finally made to the kitchen, where I drank half a gallon of green tea in one chug. I could see, in a multidimensional way, the tea hitting my stomach and being absorbed by my body. I looked down. I saw my belly, my feet, my overall human form, and it felt like I was wearing a suit, or a costume. I could feel my 41-year-old human body breaking down, slowly dying, and it was okay to know this. My legs started to weaken again. This could only mean that my soul wanted to get out yet again. So I rushed to my bed, where I laid for who knows how long, shaking, gasping, and absolutely overpowered by this feeling of complete happiness. While in bed I experienced ego death at least another 5 times, and every time my soul would leave my body, it was to show me new and wonderful things. It's been 12 hours since my trip, and I'm forgetting about all of it pretty quick, which is a shame. Again, there's a reason for that. But I distinctly recall seeing some scenes of ancient history. I saw written language being developed many years ago. Also, I remember being shown scenes of everyday life in what looked like India, or maybe a lost culture. I also understood that my soul has left my body a few times before this trip, recalling an experience when I was 12 years old and had the measles with extremely high fever, and other times when I was a little kid, also while yawning. I had no idea of this. Back to the trip. I'm lying in bed and my soul would keep jumping in and out of my body, which was very tiresome. I felt exhausted, yet so full of joy that I didn't want this to end. I decided that I needed to eat something, but I wasn't hungry at all. So I smoked some weed in an attempt to get the munchies. Bad decision. I think smoking pot restarted my trip, this time with a bad vibe. I started walking, but my legs gave out and I just collapsed onto the floor, flat on my ass. I was pretty sure I was going to die, and I perfectly remember having the choice to let go and die, or keep living. Either way, I'd be fine. I immediately thought of my little daughters and decided that I couldn't die and leave them without a dad. I realised this was my ego talking, since I grew up without a dad, and it sucked. I started sweating like I never had before, dripping all over the hallway, but I knew by then that I wasn't going to die. I realised that I was in control of this trip, and it was up to me to make it a wonderful experience, or a hellish one. I stepped into a shower, opened the faucet, and the water felt incredible. The moment the water touched my skin, I instantly knew that this water was as old as the universe. Every molecule of it felt like part of me, just like I'm part of everything. While in the shower, my soul leapt in and out at least 2 more times, being necessary to sit in the bathtub because my legs would stop supporting me. After the shower, I slowly returned to being the old me. I got really hungry, ate everything in the fridge, drank the rest of my tea, and went to bed. Like I said, memories from this mind-shattering trip are fading quickly, and eventually my ego will take over again. All in all, this trip has been an awesome experience. I know my life will never be the same. Everything was being shown to me in such a gentle and loving way. I was overcome with pure joy, for the first time in my life. I have truly seen the world, and it's beautiful beyond description. A rude awakening. Medicine. 30 mg of 4-ACO DMT, administered orally. Intention. The intention was to repeat the experience I had with a previous trip, same medicine and dose, about 5 weeks ago. You can see the full trip report here. I'll link it in the description. After doing some research and posting the last report here, I understood I had a samadhi experience. I was shocked by the few glimpses I had of the Absolute and could not really understand it. And as a side note, for those who don't know, a samadhi is the experience of spiritual enlightenment when the self, the mind and the object of meditation merge together into one. I also had the intention to try to get a healing trip. Some background. I've been doing Kriya Yoga daily for about 7 months now. I'm currently mastering the mental Kriya lesson as described in the book Leo recommends in his video. I also do concentration training, 20 to 30 minutes daily, and I also sit to meditate, basically doing nothing before I go to sleep, for as long as I can remain seated. I have started to feel more energy moving through my body, and sometimes I can perceive the different frequencies of the chakras very strongly, for example at the end of the Kriya session during the concentration phase. This has also led me to be able to meditate and rest, doing nothing for longer periods, every time easier than the last. This is how I know that I have been integrating the previous trips I had. Until more recently I have managed to start contemplating the trip. So I made all the preparations, and at 3:15 PM I took the medicine. Then I seated, relaxed and drank some ginger tea, as it helps me avoid nausea and body load during the come up phase. I listened to some hang drum meditation music, which I also found great during the come up phase. During this time I also made some bilateral symmetry movements. I started to have some visuals, though this time not so strong as in previous trips. I then started looking at my hand to get grounded in actuality, and I realised my fingers were moving very fast, almost as if they were vibrating. This is something that either I have not realised before, or I had not experienced until this moment. I found it interesting and just let it be. Around the 30-minute mark or so, I decided to lay down on the floor, over a mat. As I was laying there on my stomach, I was captivated by the fact that the mat was so close to my eyes, and yet seemed so infinite, endless and so far away. I then suddenly entered this hyper-awareness state, and directly recognised that it was this similar experience from the previous trip. The boundaries of my body simply were no more, and I felt as if I was expanding very quickly. My breathing also slowed down a lot, up to the point I could not perceive it. I stopped listening to music as the effect of the medicine was getting stronger, and decided to concentrate and go full into the experience. At some point, something clicked inside of me, and I had this feeling that somehow I already knew all of this, as if it were an old memory from my childhood. It was as if I could remember I could access this hyper-awareness state when I was a kid, and I just remembered about it. I then realised that, as the ego tried to take back control, I started to feel overwhelmed by the connection with the infinite and the whole experience, but had no fear or anxiety. At some point I changed position and put on a couple of ear caps, because there were some external distracting noises. I started to notice a lot of high frequency sounds, and I was able to reach a deeper, higher level of awareness, and feel a very deep and strong connection with God, in all directions, and I also realised that I was in a state where time does not exist. I turned to look at my hands at several occasions, trying to ground myself in reality, and at least one time I remember I was not able to recognise them. I find it fascinating that I was very aware during the whole experience, that for moments I was not feeling the boundaries of my body, and yet I could move the eyes. I then had the realisation that God had taken control of my eyes and was looking at itself. It was also a very blissful state, a feeling of total completeness and full of love. And yet, as the ego was reassembling every time with more and more strength, I started to feel that I was losing it, that I was going mad, as my brain was trying to conceptualise and reduce to ideas the greatness of this blissful state. Around the 90-minute mark, I got really hungry and decided to go to the kitchen to eat something. I was still in this hyper-awareness state, in ecstasy and at the same time feeling completely mad for being able to feel such a deep connection with God so easily. I remember a moment I was standing by the window and being able to feel as if I was connected to everything and nothing. It was as if I could understand what a paradox is for the first time at the level of being. I had some food prepared, so heating it up in the microwave was not a very hard task, even though I found my clumsy movements very funny. I then started eating, and in the same time started to feel how the ego was getting reassembled. I had then this thought where I made the conscious decision to go back to the form state. And as I was making the decision to come back to the dream, this process just happened. I then get a glimpse of the infinite layers of consciousness that constitute reality in the self, and then the hyper-awareness state starts to fade away. I realise it by being able to see, feel and recognise my hand much more solid as I look at it. All of this happens as I hear my girlfriend getting into the house, and getting closer to where I am. I get this last thought as if I were reading the mind of God when she gets in the apartment. Oh, that is also me, but there I am not currently being aware of myself. I then had a very nice evening with my girlfriend, trying to tell her what I had just experienced, but I quickly realised that I just seemed like a complete insane person to her, which just brought me to laugh. One thing I really like from psilocin is that it shows my ways to be more social, to express my feelings and emotions more freely and easily, which I then see reflected in the conversations and interactions with others. Around 7 PM, 4 hours after taking the medicine, I went for a walk in the forest, which starts very close to where I live. I then realised that I felt very balanced and complete, and started to ask myself how I could integrate this and make it more permanent in my daily life. The next day I tried to reorganise thoughts and remember as much as I could, writing everything down on the afternoon and doing some other stuff. I decided to smoke some weed and just tried to relax and try to remember some more of the trip and concrete insights that I had. I know mixing weed with mushrooms and LSD is not a good idea, yet I'd tried a similar experience before where I had 100 UG LSD, and the next day I smoked a little bit of weed and the experience of the LSD came back, in a peaceful way. But this time it was different. After I smoked, I got shocked very deeply by the realisation that we are all one, that it is only me here, and I am always interacting with me, and I felt utterly and completely alone. I realised that I am just playing games with myself. I was like, oh my god, with the mouth completely open. I got very scared, and realised that my ego was totally rejecting this realisation. This time I really felt I was going really crazy and physically dying. I guess I was confronted with the paradox again, but I was completely rejecting it. I then started to panic, so I tried to sit down and meditate, but it only got worse. I realised I was having a panic attack, as I felt my blood pressure was increasing up to 130 BPM, and started to feel my body as very hot. So I changed my clothes to something lighter, drank some juice and took a cold shower. The cold shower really helped ground me again. All of this happened in a lapse of 10 to 15 minutes. I then told my girlfriend I just had a panic attack because I had this strong realisation that I could not accept, and asked her to hug me. I felt so fucking humbled, as in that very moment I could understand what it means to love myself, seeing me in everyone and everything. I then could finally relax and start to accept this deep, deep insight. Conclusions. I got some powerful insights from these mere glimpses into the mind of God. I feel that for the very first time I had this realisation or awakening at the level of being that felt several orders of magnitude or dimensions greater than a rational or conceptual realisation. I now know how following this path and accepting the unknown is a huge leap of faith, as I've never felt so scared in my life, and yet it comes with a great reward at the end, because deeply inside of me I can feel this deep connection with God. I got some understanding of what it means to be a singularity that has no diameter and is yet infinite, infinite in every possible way. I also got some understanding of what a paradox is and how challenging and scary it can be when the mind tries to wrap around it conceptualize it, and fails to merely accept it. At some point when my ego dissolved and I remained being here, it was as if nothing had changed. This made me realize I am God, and as God in the formless state, I cannot die, and that I have nothing to fear. I realized that this ego is just a part of me, and even after physical death happens, it will remain in the vastness of God forever. I also realized that time as I perceive it, linearly and progressing in just one direction, is just a projection of greater dimensions that are highly non-linear, and it equally does not exist. I also see how I have to accept everything, and not just the things that the ego find good or acceptable for my survival agenda. I have been doing the different practices very rigorously every day, and because of this I can see strong gains and progress on every trip, something that keeps me motivated during the low energy ego backlash phases. I love being mind-fucked, but it really scared the shit out of me that I felt I was at the verge of a psychotic breakdown, or about to die. Prior to this, I've not had so many strong anxiety or panic attacks for more than a decade. They all used to happen by abusing weed, which made me stop using it. I now understand that during these previous bad trips with weed, I may have had some strong realizations that I was not able to understand and accept. It isn't until just more recently that I've tried to approach weed again, in a much more calmed approach. I know that I made a mistake by smoking weed after taking the psilocin, and now I know that psychedelics are medicines that have to be highly respected. Questions. By now I have had around 10 psychedelic experiences between mushrooms and LSD, but just most recently I've started to feel that I am losing the sensation of reality and that I am going crazy. I have read that this is to be expected, but I just do not want to go in a wrong direction. I then started to question me. Shall I expect this process of going mad to become more intense? Or is it maybe because I am going too fast? Is there anything that can be done to make it lighter for the ego? Do you have any recommendations to better integrate the trips? Thank you if you made it this far. I hope that my experiences have helped you. Who knows? As always, thanks a lot to the great community of Actualize.org and to Leo Gura for all his works and great teachings. The God Inside, a 25C NBOME and 4-ACO DMT trip report by Carcinogenius, uploaded to earwid.org February 6, 2012. I poured 32mg of 4-ACO DMT into a glass of Sprite, and prepped 600 micrograms of 25C NBOME for nasal administration while the 4-ACO dissolved. I sprayed the liquid NBOME solution into my nose, and chased it with the now dissolved psychedelic Sprite cocktail. My intention was to experience a strong tryptamine-phenethylamine combo and see how far I could push it. Also, I was trying to gain some confidence on a few issues and work a few things out. I accomplished all these goals and then some. For me, M-bombs are the quickest psychedelic come-up I've experienced, with the exception of DMT, and the method administration, nasally, obviously helps quite a bit too. This time was no exception. Within 10 minutes the M-bomb is coming on strong. Everything is breathing and wiggling, and my mind and body feel like how a rocket might feel before takeoff. In the next 25 or 30 minutes, the 4-ACO made its effects known, and there was no denying the tryptamine-induced, jewel-encrusted world I was now in. Time essentially creeped to a halt at around this point, and I knew I needed to go lay down. I laid down in my bedroom with my dog sprawled out on my lap. I laid there for at least 2 hours, as was ushered through one of the most perfect and happy psychedelic states I have ever experienced. At the hour-and-a-half mark, things were definitely at their peak. I was consumed, and looking out the bedroom door and into the living room, the world seemed like an explosion of colour. Some colours I struggled to put a name on. The things I saw were not of this world. They were non-physical. More powerful and more important than visual manifestations in my opinion though, was the wonderful mind state I was now settled into. I swear I've never been happier in my entire life. I smiled so big and for so long that my face hurt all day afterwards. I had some serious pressure from my college schedule at the moment, and was seriously doubting my intelligence and ability to get through this semester. I went into the trip with the intent to eliminate those doubtful and anxiety-ridden thoughts I couldn't shake any other way, and thankfully it did the trick and then some. I don't want to attribute anxiety relief completely to the drugs though. I find that psychedelics make it easier to do work on yourself, probably how meditation allows others to work on themselves in such a way. I feel like it does this by letting the person look at himself or herself in a new perspective. I felt like this was the most essential psychedelic breakthrough experience, and I felt integrated with the whole. At this point, I understood something I've always failed to grasp. I suddenly realised the purpose of life, since there seems to be no real practical purpose. The God that is in all of us, and the God that created all of this, is one and the same. God created life simply to let itself experience an infinite possibility of life. By dispersing God's own consciousness into billions upon billions of souls, God can experience all facets of reality, and take in the brevity of possible experience, and especially love. At this point I closed my eyes and covered my face up with a blanket, turning the already dim room to pitch black. I had the sensation of flying or floating. I felt utterly weightless. I looked around and was surrounded on all sides by semi-transparent black glass-like interwoven tubes, flowing with some sort of bright grey liquid substance. I felt as if my very being was supported by these structures. It felt very inviting and safe there. I continually had the suspicion that someone or something was there, and I felt like I was being watched. My suspicions were confirmed as two entities, exactly identical to ones I have seen in previous DMT trips, made themselves visible in front of me. Continuously rotating diamond-like objects made up of their bodies. It was clearly of a texture non-physical. It was breathtaking. Another entity appeared from in between them, and I felt a message. Not telepathically really, I just knew. This was God. The everything. It turned its head towards me, and I was in total shock and disbelief. It looked exactly like me. Same height, same face. The only difference was the body was made of the same light-like material the other entities were composed of. Shocked, I opened my eyes and was back in my bed surrounded by furniture and walls, layered with light and colours of every possible formulation. I realised right then that God is nothing more than each of us, without our brain to filter out the reality that exists beyond the physical realm, and then I instantly felt comfortable with death. Knowing that all death will be is freedom from the body and reintegration with the whole, to be immortal, and maybe possibly go on to live another life in another world. Or who knows what will really happen. Nobody knows until they're there, and it really is the most exciting and beautiful mystery of life. I tripped for a total of 7 or 8 hours maybe, and had possibly the best trip I have ever experienced. I never once lost control and was in total ecstasy the entire time. I had many revelations during this trip. The spiritual one was quite beautiful and made me smile bigger than I have in years. Another idea I had though, as simple as this may be, was about the meaning of life. I realised that life is quite simple. You just find that person who loves you back, learn how to relax, and then die. I felt this idea was so profound I had to write it down. I knew it was simple, but the thought of my perfect girlfriend and my perfect life, to be followed by eternal peace as a DMT light being after death, it was all so beautiful. I had it figured all out. But like all trip-induced revelations, the following day reading the words, they seem simple and don't mean as much. I was happy, yes, but there is no way during normal brain function to feel as happy as I was in that state. It is acceptance of life and death. It is instant peace and total understanding of the universe and of the soul. It waits for each of us after death. The Infinity of Existence, a 4-ACO DMT trip report by Psilocin Psychonaut, uploaded to Irwid October 31st, 2019. I'll start with some relevant background information about me. As of writing this, I've done psilocybin mushrooms over 10 times, 4-ACO DMT 5 times, LSD twice, AL-LAD twice, and ALD52 once. Around the time of this trip, I'd been smoking marijuana almost every day for a month or two. However, I was not high going into the trip. In fact, I had not smoked at all on the day in question. It was in August of 2017 that I acquired some 4-ACO DMT. I was 19 at the time. Me and a few other friends ordered several different drugs in one shipment from a research chemical site. It came in on Friday, August 4th, 2017. I'd been doing nothing but relaxing at home all day. At 9:40 PM, I met one of my friends to pick up my share. I had ordered 250 mg of 4-ACO DMT, which came in the form of a white powder. I had never taken 4-ACO DMT before. I believed on good authority that the site we ordered from is reliable, so I was certain of the amount and purity. I had to be at work at 9 AM the following day, so I really was not planning on tripping that night. When my friend gave me the powder, we talked about it for a bit. He said that 4-ACO DMT was supposed to be very similar to magic mushrooms, simply much more potent. As we discussed this, the temptation became too great. Even though I was planning on trying the substance on Sunday, I instead decided to try it that very night. I went home right away and got there at 10:10 PM. I immediately started preparing for the trip. I knew I had to get up early in the morning, so I wanted to begin the trip as soon as possible. No one else was in the house but me. I closed all the blinds, as I often get paranoid and anxious at the idea of my neighbours seeing me acting weird while tripping. I turned on the alarm on my phone as well, and the only thing I had to do before beginning was to unplug my downstairs toilet. I decided this would take too long, and I went upstairs to ingest the 4-ACO DMT. I decided I would unplug the toilet immediately after, before I started proper tripping. It was 10:25 PM when I went upstairs to prepare the dose. At this point it is relevant to mention that I did not have any sort of scale. In my case it turned out okay, but I highly recommend that anyone taking this drug gets a scale first. 4-ACO DMT is relatively potent. As little as 10 mg can change the magnitude of a trip. This is often equal to just a pinch of extra powder. Please scale this substance if you plan on ingesting it. That being said, I knew how potent the substance was and I honestly did not care. At that time, I had not tripped in a few months and I really just wanted to have a fun, intense trip. I eyeballed what I thought was 40 mg. I put it in a parachute, a makeshift pill made of joint paper, and swallowed it. It was exactly 10:30 PM when I ingested the dose. I knew it would hit me fast, but I wasn't prepared for just how fast it was. Parachutes dissolve quickly in your stomach, and because my 4-ACO DMT was in powder form, it was rapidly absorbed into my body. Additionally, I had taken it on an empty stomach, which possibly made absorption even faster. I felt the come up starting at 10:31 PM. I was surprised to feel it coming on so soon. At 10:35 PM, I could tell that I was coming up way faster than I thought I would. My thought patterns started changing, and I felt a warm glow all over my body. It felt extremely similar to a come up on mushrooms. At this point, I was taking in how fast the drug was hitting me. I knew right away that I had taken a large dose and felt it was going to be an insane trip. I briefly experienced a moment of panic where I thought to myself, oh shit, this is going to be rough. However, I quickly remembered that it was far too late for that. I relaxed, accepted the fact that I was going on this trip, and mentally prepared myself for the journey ahead. At 10:40 PM, I was well into the come up. I was still largely in control, but the decisions I was making started making less and less sense. My thoughts were moving coherently, but not down a path that coincided with logic. I could still maintain a train of thought, but my thoughts started getting weirder, as they do on mushrooms. The body high felt amazing. I felt pleasant rushes of warmth moving up and down and all around my body. Various other bodily sensations appeared, like tingling and a feeling like electricity was passing through me. At 10:45 PM, I was tripping fairly hard. Coherent thought was no longer an option for me. I would decide to do something, like walk downstairs. Then, like flicking a switch, my thought processes instantly changed and I decided to walk around upstairs some more instead. This often happens to me on mushrooms. Indeed, most of the trip felt almost identical to a mushroom trip, albeit a bit more intense than one I've ever had. Minor visuals were starting to appear as well. Bright colours, breathing walls, slight distortions here and there. The body high had died down a bit, but the mental effects were becoming more and more intense. I started to get extremely confused. My last recognisable thought before I totally blasted off was that I had to go downstairs and unplug the toilet before I became totally debilitated. At 11 PM, I was definitely in the trip proper. I regretfully do not remember much of the timeline beyond this point. The trip was very intense and warped my understanding of time thoroughly. I remember the rough chronology of the content of the trip, but exact times are impossible to remember. I was tripping way too hard to even check a clock, let alone understand the concept of time. Beyond 11 PM, most of what I was saying and thinking made no sense. Logical and coherent thought were totally gone. Instead of going to the bathroom to unplug the toilet, I watched some trippy videos on my computer instead. I slowly became more confused as I went down the rabbit hole. Additionally, I lost the majority of control I had over my body at this point. Walking became disjointed and uncoordinated. I started stumbling into random rooms in my house, unable to decide how I wanted to spend the trip. When I finally made it into my downstairs bathroom, the first time to unplug the toilet, I started laughing uncontrollably. I knew I was already tripping too hard, and found it hilarious that I was now unable to do such a simple task because I started tripping before I unplugged the toilet. I tried to flush it down, and when that didn't work I started to panic. I knew my mum was coming home in the morning. I thought that if I left the toilet plugged, she would notice something was out of place, and would know I had taken psychedelics of some kind. Some part of me knew that this was bullshit, and so for a while I got stuck in a thought loop trying to decide if a plugged toilet would cause my mum to know if I had taken drugs. The visuals started to get more intense while I was in the bathroom. When I looked at my face in the mirror, it would melt, shrink, grow, and morph in various ways. Little spirals and shapes would briefly appear on my skin. At this point, the body high was not as noticeable. Rather, I felt a sensation I can only describe as feeling my emotions in my body. If I felt anxious, my whole body felt anxious. It was not just a physical reaction to extreme emotions, it was something much more intense, vivid, and personal than I can put into words. In a flash, I forgot about the toilet and left the bathroom to go into my room. My emotions up until now had been changing in much the same way that my thoughts were changing. I would quickly cycle through anxiety, fear, and confusion over and over again. It wasn't a bad part of the trip by any sense. It was emotionally and physically exhausting, but I knew these thoughts and emotions are products of the trip. It was slightly unpleasant, but it wasn't a nightmare. However, soon after I got into my room, I decided the trip was too intense, and I wanted it to be over. I tried to end it by going to bed. I changed into my pyjamas, turned off the lights, and got into bed. I tried my hardest to close my eyes and relax. Obviously, this didn't work, and I quickly realised that my efforts were to be fruitless. I got out of bed, and was well on my way to the peak at this point. Most of the rest of the trip was spent wandering around the house, talking to myself as I had earth-shattering realisations. However, after I left my bed, the trip took a much more positive turn. I started feeling less confusion. Instead, I started experiencing euphoria and uncontrollable laughter, and sometimes I felt several different emotions at once. Multiple times I would wander back into the washroom. Upon seeing that the toilet was still plugged and realising that I kept forgetting about it, I couldn't stop laughing, as I found this absolutely hilarious. I would talk to the toilet about how funny it was that I'm tripping so hard, and how I'm probably going to forget again in a moment, then come back and find the situation even more hilarious. Of course, every time that is exactly what happened. Once I peaked, I had many visual and auditory hallucinations throughout the remainder of the trip. However, I cannot remember the exact order in which they occurred. Additionally, I experienced a major realisation during the trip, and in the interest of presenting it here in a complete coherent fashion, I've decided to describe all the major visual and auditory hallucinations in one section of this report. The visuals in this trip were quite spectacular, and completely trumped any of the hallucinations I'd experienced in previous trips. The walls and floors of my house moved, morphed, and tilted widely, and not just a bit. The dimensions of my house changed so drastically that at times it seemed like I was in rooms several times bigger than the room I knew I was in. Sometimes the room would seem impossibly small, instead of impossibly big. Whenever I looked down at the shag carpet in my bedroom, it turned into hundreds of tiny spinning pieces of trident-shaped plastic. At one point during the trip, I started staring at a ceiling tile in my room. A green spiral of dots came out of the tile, and slowly this hallucination encompassed my entire vision. until all I could see was hallucinogenic patterns and lights. The Skyrim and GTA posters above my TV became 3D holographic projections, and morphed into shifting fractal patterns at the same time. Every so often, my vision would become pixelated, almost like I was living in an 8-bit world. This usually did not last long, but it happened many times during the trip. Even though I never touched the light switch, I saw various lights throughout my house flicking on and off. Sometimes it would just be a portion of the room, while sometimes the whole room or house would become dark. When I tried to use my computer, it was difficult to do so, as the programs kept on moving around the screen, morphing and disappearing. Any time I focused on using one program, everything else on the screen would become very blurred, as if out of focus. When I looked at my face in the mirror, it morphed and shifted much more drastically than before, and sometimes I didn't even recognise myself. Various patterns and shapes would enter my field of vision, then quickly leave. Specifically, I remember seeing an oversized version of Majora's Mask come flying at me before it quickly disappeared. My vision for the entire trip felt very blurred. Everything was slightly out of focus, and when I tried to concentrate on one thing to focus my vision, a hallucination usually formed and grew. These are just the specific hallucinations I remember. I know I've forgotten many of them, and even if I did remember them all, words would not do justice to their beauty. Everything I looked at was changed or distorted in some way. No texture or shape was identical to reality. I also experienced several brief OBEs during the peak of the trip. I've forgotten the details of most of them, but still remember two quite clearly. While pacing around my living room, I randomly decided to lie down on the carpet. I thought to myself, how cool would it be if I just closed my eyes and had an out-of-body experience? Hilariously enough, when I closed my eyes, I felt my surroundings dissolve into nothingness. A few moments later, I found myself flying through the Grand Canyon like Superman. I could see this beautiful blue sky above me and the majesty of the Grand Canyon below me. I felt completely free, like I could go anywhere and explore anything. This was my first ever out-of-body experience, and although it was brief, it was quite an amazing one. The second OBE happened when I was lying down on my bed with my eyes closed. I was enjoying some spectacular mental visuals when a very intense, very pleasant body high washed over me. Quite suddenly, I found myself walking through a forest. Somehow I knew that I was in Texas, even though there were no indications of that. I walked down a path lined with pine trees, taking in the tranquil and surreal environment. Just as quickly as it began, I found myself lying in my bed once again as I opened my eyes. The auditory hallucinations were a little less pleasant. Multiple times I heard a fly loudly buzzing around my head, which would annoy me until I realised it wasn't real. Additionally, several times throughout the trip I heard people walking around in my house, which again scared me before I realised they weren't real. Loud thuds and bangs startled me at first, but as the trip went on I grew to accept the unpredictability and intensity of the auditory hallucinations I was experiencing. As I approached the peak, my thoughts were bouncing around much more quickly than before. It was no longer a case of thinking of one thing for a few seconds before thinking of something else. My mind was going rapid fire at this point. I could not stay on one thought for more than a split second before thinking of something else. I remember thinking that during the peak in particular, the trip felt much like my first LSD experience. Although the rest of the trip felt more like I was on mushrooms, the peak for some reason seemed more like LSD. As I hit my peak, I felt what I can only describe as the most amazing feeling I've ever felt in my life. It was far beyond the combination of pure happiness, perfect confidence and complete self-realization. Every facet of my perception was touched. My mind, body and soul simply felt totally amazing. I cannot truly communicate this feeling to any other human being, because no human language has the words that properly define this feeling. It was the most deeply personal, profound and psychedelic experience I have ever had. I loved myself and everything about me in a way I was never able to before. It was as if I never knew how amazing I really was before that point. I felt utterly complete in every aspect as a human being. I accepted my failures and weaknesses and appreciated my successes and strengths. I accepted that I am me. I loved everything about myself and realised that I am amazing. This feeling was maintained consistently for the remainder of the trip. Feeling perfect confidence in myself and my abilities, I felt like I had the power to do anything. And I do mean literally anything. I realised that if I have the power to do anything, I must be a living god. This made me feel even more amazing about myself. After all, who wouldn't be happy to be a god with the power to do anything? I also knew, however, that I wouldn't have this power forever. I knew I was going to come down from the trip. Therefore, I should use this power I have in the moment to do something that will improve my life in the long term. I remembered my lifelong dream of becoming a famous rapper, and realised I now have the power to write the perfect rap song that will make me famous. I went downstairs and started typing what I believed at the time to be the best rap song ever created. I was laughing hysterically while typing it, because I couldn't believe how easy it was to write raps. Below is a small excerpt. That was so amazing. What do I even say? I'm blown away on everything I say, because everything I tried to said was morphed and carried away to another place. Like seriously, what can I say, a crazy place where only crazy people like to stay? I'm carried away like Dr. Zeus, a Mr. NSA agent who is watching from a safety place, would possibly look at all this and judge safely that I am insane, but I refrain possibly because I can prevent and decide anew again the only difference that I'd possibly preclude if you all choose and decided that each one would like to stay. It sounded brilliant to me at the time. I believe I was trying to record how amazing I was feeling in the form of rap. As I went back upstairs, I started trying to reconcile the fact that I have the power to do anything with the fundamental truths of reality. I thought that if everything in the universe is matter and energy, and all matter and energy follows the laws of physics, and these laws of physics do not change, then the way all matter and energy moves is also unchanging. Additionally, human knowledge of these laws of physics is irrelevant. Gravity behaves the same now as it did when we were cavemen. So if I am made of matter and energy, then everything that happens in my life is predetermined. How then could I have the power to do anything? My conclusion to this question led me to even higher levels of psychedelic amazingness. I concluded that the multiple realities theory must be true. That is, I believed there to be an infinite number of realities parallel to ours, where every possible choice and outcome plays out. Just as in this reality I chose to have this trip, there is another where I decided I shouldn't trip because I had work in the morning. These realities are also all happening concurrently to ours. That is, they are all happening at once. I started imagining all the different possible realities, easily visualizing them as mental imagery. Ones where my choices caused my life to turn out drastically different than mine has. I experienced what could be described as ego death. At that point, I didn't really care what happened to me. If I died right at that point from a stroke, why would it matter? I am just one perspective in an infinite set of parallel realities. Anything that happens to me is supposed to happen, because in another identical reality, it doesn't happen. In a way, my choices don't really matter at all. But since everything I could have done in my life does happen in all the realities where I was born, technically I still have the power to do anything, just not in this particular reality. I then started to add more layers of infinity to this thought, as I remembered a video I watched explaining the 11 dimensions theory. I imagined all the realities that could possibly exist according to any initial position of atoms during the Big Bang. I realised that the number of these realities is even more infinite than the realities possible in this universe. Then, I imagined the infinity of universes that could exist given any possible laws of physics. All of these realities were also happening at the same time as ours. I viewed everything that was happening to me at the moment and everything in my life as just one perspective in this grand set of all the different possible realities, each one containing an infinite number of perspectives like mine, and all of it happening at the same time. And when I say perspective, I mean any perspective. If everything in the universe is matter and energy, then all living beings and all inanimate objects are one and the same. My personal perspective is the same as a hydrogen atom's, only I have the ability to perceive and think, because my particular arrangement of atoms lets me process and respond to stimuli. My mind was simply open to so many wild possibilities. The thoughts and scenarios racing through my mind were incredible. One thought I remember was that I realised I could be in a reality where there is a planet of aliens millions of light years away reading my thoughts. Another was that in one possible reality there is a cult who chants the words going through my head. Even if the words didn't mean the same thing, I realised it is technically possible the words that make up that cult's chants are the same ones I am thinking right now. I realised I would never be able to determine which reality I truly lived in out of the infinite ones possible. One line from Peter Baelish from Game of Thrones kept coming back to me and reinforced this idea of infinite, concurrently occurring realities.
Every possible series of events is happening, all at once. Live that way, and nothing will surprise you. Everything that happens will be something that you've seen before.
The only way to describe what happened next would be to say that I combined the 11 dimensions theory with the idea that time is cyclical and repetitive in nature. I imagined that all of existence was actually never ending, so to speak. I thought that not only do I have the power to do anything, in the sense that all the different versions of me have done everything I could have possibly done, but I have the power to experience any perspective conceivably possible. I thought I had the power to transport to any reality that could possibly be imagined, and experience any perspective that could possibly be imagined as well. For instance, I could be a Game of Thrones character, or the Butterbot from Rick and Morty. This is because time is cyclical, and my perspective is just one of infinite. When my life ends, it will go on to be the next perspective in the next cosmic time cycle. I realise that all perspectives are one perspective, and this singular, united perspective is the only one which experiences any and all facets of existence. That's the only way I can really describe that. I am you, you are the Butterbot from Rick and Morty, Morty is us. All perspectives of any conceivably possible forms of existence are all one perspective, and this perspective experiences the grand wheel of creation for all eternity. And that is why time and choice are irrelevant, because everything is happening, has happened, and always will happen according to the initial coordinates and laws of physics of each particular universe. Everything in existence, in all possible realities, every atom, every photon, every property of every quark and muon, everything is one and the same. All possible things in the past, present and future are inherently connected. Separation in both time and space is an illusion. The level of detail, depth and complexity kept going to infinity in such a way that I humanly grasped the cosmic concept of infinity. Simply put, everything is everything and always has and always will. I realise I don't have to wonder about what being Ned Stark feels like, because I will eventually experience his life one day. My perspective is just part of this grand cosmic perspective that constitutes the perception of all that theoretically exists. Even this explanation does not do it justice, and I will never be able to communicate with words how I felt to another human being. I truly lost all sense of time and reality on that trip. As I started to come down from the peak a bit, I was in utter disbelief and awe of what I had just experienced. I believe it was sometime around 5 AM that I started to regain some control. I went downstairs and started typing on my computer again. I wanted to record the raw details of the trip while I was tripping, because I knew I would forget otherwise. Much of the content of the above 5 or so paragraphs was written during this trip, even if I cleaned it up after the fact. The rest of the trip was spent playing with the idea of infinite realities, and imagining of many different worlds and scenarios. I was mostly still in awe of the peak, and I was still in disbelief it had actually happened. It's one thing to read about these kinds of trips online, but it's another thing entirely to actually experience it. I had a brief moment of anxiety near the end, because I knew I had to open all the blinds in the house. I thought my mum would find it suspicious otherwise. However, I knew I was still tripping, and worried someone would see me acting weird. At 6 AM, I was coming down more, and managed to finally unplug the toilet downstairs. I decided I would take a few bong rips before settling into bed. I definitely started tripping harder after I did. I didn't really fall asleep, but rather achieved a sort of half-sleep, half-tripping state. I felt mostly happy and content during the entire come down. The trip simply became less intense as time went on. As I tried to sleep, I was mentally still tripping, and my thoughts were still slightly confused. When I woke up for work at 7:45 AM, I was still slightly tripping, but I managed to return to some sort of baseline by the time I got to work at 8:45 AM. At work, I was out of it the whole day. I was sober, but tired. I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. It was extremely intense, but also an amazing experience, and I was still trying to process it. I felt a similar afterglow that I get after doing psychedelics. I felt very enlightened, like I had learnt some secret universal truth. I also felt a certain sense of inner peace. These feelings lasted for about a week after the trip, and to a lesser extent, for 2 months after. I tried to take 300 micrograms of AL-LAD on August 6th. It came in the same shipment as the 4-ACO DMT, and so I knew it was also pure. To my surprise, I learnt that the cross-tolerance between 4-ACO DMT and AL-LAD is extreme. I felt no high at all from the AL-LAD. If there was any, it was indistinguishable from the THC in my system. After 4 hours of nothing, I took another 150 micrograms, but still felt no significant high. In my opinion, this is strong evidence of a cross-tolerance between the substances, as 450 micrograms of lab-quality AL-LAD would normally induce a strong trip. I am 100% confident that the substance was pure. It was stored correctly in an airtight, opaque, dry container, and the container was kept in a cool floor safe. However, I did take another 300 micrograms of the same AL lad on August 12th and got the expected result, a strong trip. On August 19th, I tripped on 25 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT alone in my house. A week after that, I did 2 grams of psilocybin mushrooms with some friends while we watched the Mayweather-McGregor match. On September 2nd, I tripped on 21 milligrams of 4-ACO DMT while camping with 2 friends who were also tripping. All of these were fantastic trips. I believe the afterglow from the trip described in this report lasted so long because I took psychedelics so much in the following weeks. As of writing this, however, I have not done any more psychedelics besides the ones I have mentioned in this report. This trip helped cement my agnostic views. I reasoned that if there are infinite realities that I can imagine in my mind, and all these possibilities, although amazing and wonderful, are equally without proof, then similarly, any specific religion is also beyond proof. In fact, everything is subjective and impossible to prove in this way, even truth and our own perception. Proof isn't real, truth is an illusion. We can't even be sure of the nature of our own existence, and that includes if we even exist at all. I already believed these things before this trip, so my views weren't changed, but they were certainly reinforced. I gained a lot from this trip, and it was an amazing positive experience for me. In fact, it was probably the single most amazing and incredible experience of my entire life. I've never before felt the way that I did on this trip. I regret not scaling the substance, but it was an incredible trip, so I don't regret going through with it. I wanted to trip afterwards even more than I did before. I also found that writing things down during the trip aided me significantly in remembering it afterwards. On August 7th, I composed a basic trip report and posted it online. Reflecting on the whole trip and writing out an entire report helped me significantly remembering the trip long after it happened. Not only that, but I found I gained much more enjoyment from remembering the trip because I was able to share it with others. I was also able to process it and take away a few lessons. Primarily among those, I learned to have more of an acceptance of suffering in my life in general, but in particular, accepting the realities of my life. I truly accepted that there are unbreakable laws of physics, and even though I can imagine infinite worlds and realities, it doesn't mean I can escape the realities and responsibilities of my life. I'm not a god right now. I can't do anything I want. I have to deal with my problems and barriers to my success. I have to accept the suffering in my life as a consequence of my actions, but since choice is action and illusion, there's no point in being unhappy or stressing about suffering. Suffering is unavoidable. Just accept it, and try to make your life and everyone else's life better. That's all I or anyone else can and should do. Partly because I remembered so much of the trip and reflected on it so significantly, I still feel I have gained valuable insights from the trip and have benefited from it. Even now, more than 3 months later, I can still apply the lessons I learnt to my life, and I still think the trip was an amazing experience that improved my life and outlook on it significantly. Although I learnt my lesson with regards to scaling substances, I still don't regret going through with the trip, and I would do the same thing again given a second chance. One thing I still can't get over, however, is my quasi-disbelief that the trip occurred. It really was so amazing that I have to keep telling myself that I experienced what I did. And if it weren't for the section of the trip report that I recorded during the trip, I'd probably think that I hadn't experienced what I thought I had. Two weeks ago, my friend managed to link me up with someone in the local area selling trippy chocolates, each of which contained around 30 mg of 4-ACO DMT inside of them. I'd taken 4-ACO once a few years back with a mate of mine at a dosage of around 20 mg I think, and it was majorly intense and sedating to say the least, although not as spiritually profound as the experience I was going to have. The substance is often compared to a mushroom trip due to the similar subjective effects and its qualities as a prodrug to psilocin, although this varies wildly from person to person. I'm one of those people it had a radically different effect on. I managed to sort out 3 of the chocolates, but had no clue at first what the exact dosage was for each of them. I deliberated on taking just one, but ended up fully diving into the deep end and consumed all 3 later on at night around 10 PM. I had the lovely idea of just tripping out on my sofa downstairs and sitting through some films I fancied rewatching. The lockdown here in the UK has been especially disheartening, and I couldn't think of anything better to do than get trippy and consume some media. So I got Tokyo Godfathers by Satoshi Kon and Melancholia by Lars von Trier downloaded, and expected myself just to sit through them in a trippy state. It was safe to say that this evening did not go to plan whatsoever. I messaged one of the people who sorted me out with the chocolates, and asked them if they knew the specific dose of each of them. Before consuming all 3 of them, I'd assumed there would only be a minimum of 10 mg in each one of the chockies. Nothing too mad. You can imagine my shock upon the dealer informing me that there was 30 mg in each one. My heart sank and I was washed over with a debilitating wave of anxiety as I realised what I had just gotten myself into. My friend, who had only ever taken 2 at once, was in pure disbelief that I'd gone the full mile and eaten all 3. I knew that my simple night of tripping out watching some funky movies was not going to play out like I intended. This was going to be far more intense. Even as someone who is very familiar with high doses of psychedelics, the lack of information regarding doses of 4-ACO past 60 mg was worrying to say the least. I've had some pretty chaotic ego death-like experiences in the past, and the last thing I wanted to happen tonight was me stripping off all my clothes and pissing on my parents whilst they were asleep. I managed to lull myself back into a state of acceptance as I continued to watch Tokyo Godfathers, a great anime film by Satoshi Kon which was utterly mesmerising as I began to feel the onset of the drug begin to take effect. The animation was fluid beyond all belief. Each facial expression of the characters was impeccably detailed and well animated, and the visuals looked like they had been treated to a dose of high dynamic range via my eyes. I'm far-sighted and wear glasses, but as the 4-ACO was kicking in I noticed a major improvement in my visual acuity. Everything was going relatively well for such a humongous dose, and the fear was slowly subsiding. That was until the body load struck me in the most immense way possible. I started to have some semi-painful electric shock-like sensations batter my body, and a massive tightness around my chest and stomach gripped me like nothing I've ever experienced. This was spectacularly uncomfortable. I had also eaten very little during the day, so it only took about an hour or so for me to properly start tripping. The film had about 40 minutes left of its runtime, but I couldn't for the life of me concentrate on anything happening. My sense of hearing was all over the place, and the characters' tone, pitch and speed of their voices would vary wildly and fluctuate from scene to scene. It was plainly clear that I was losing touch with all of reality. I noticed the visuals around my front room, and they were subtle yet imbued with the distinct mushy hues and textures, complemented by fractals and hyperbolic geometry, although nowhere near as spectacular as those on high doses of LSD. As the film became exceedingly confusing and my senses began to go haywire, I decided I had to retreat to my bed and ride out the exponentially intense trip. I got in bed and attempted to watch a YouTube video, but I couldn't for the life of me discern that another person had made it and was speaking as their own self. I instead only perceived it as myself talking back to me via this video. As this happened, I noticed I was having great difficulty holding on to my sense of self, as my entire room began to merge with my very being, and my thoughts cascaded into an unbelievably ridiculous series of unfathomable thoughts and contemplations that made no sense, which finally crescendoed into a state of utter confusion as it genuinely felt as if my brain from a physical standpoint was rewiring itself. And now here's where things get even stranger. As I laid in bed and waited for my inevitable foray into the void, I closed my eyes and observed a hallucinatory amalgamation of both wonderful and disturbing visions of creatures and beautiful realms of existence. The heavenly sights and sounds were then juxtaposed with different visions of the staggeringly disturbing degrees of pain and suffering that are potential through God/universal consciousness's ability to dream up infinite dreams for itself to play inside. of which I had the distinct feeling of having been both sides of reality at once, as if I was the yin and yang incarnate. One minute I would envision graceful and playful hallucinations of Wallace and Gromit and my friends and loved ones laughing and cheering whilst dancing in circles in fields of roses, to then be met with an onslaught of demonic energy beings laughing straight at my face and forcing me to focus my awareness on the magnificently unsettling realms of darkness in which unimaginably freakish and disturbing entities and experiences lay in wait. I felt like I experienced every single possible death that a human could experience in one single setting. Despite noticing the fear inside me though, I didn't attach to any of the thoughts or feelings that were coming up. I noticed my ego trying to remain attached to reality at the best attempt it could, but I didn't give it the time of day, and I was able to fairly easily accept the magnitude of love and fear that I was being bombarded with. After this onslaught of hallucinations, I had the profound sense of emerging out of the realm of time and recognizing myself as the only being in the universe. I was no longer perceiving my room, but instead felt as if I was immersed into the very fabric of reality, a timeless void that was littered with infinite dreams, each containing worlds and universes that the average human would only associate with human-made fantasy tales like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. I was guided through this ethereal realm by a voice very similar to my girlfriend that kept telling me, "John, you've made it. This is it. It's been here forever and it'll never stop. We can explore it for eternity. Just you and me." I became aware of my higher self as the Godhead and felt like I had just experienced countless other realms of existence. I'd been reading Berserk earlier in the week, and in my mind's eye I became radically aware of how its universe and characters are contained in a dream as hyper-realistic and material as our very own reality, and that the way humans actually tap into these stories that seem realer than real when we write them down or make a film out of them are actually, in a sense, being plucked out of the slither of potential existence through universal consciousness. All the while this was happening, I had notions of sprinting in this timeless, ethereal void towards the centre of a galaxy-sized vortex that emitted blue light at the edges and radiated the whitest, most purest light I'd ever seen from its centre. As I was running towards this, my consciousness felt as if it was being flung across all possible realms, and I was being bombarded with insights into the nature of reality every single moment I was in this void. The duality between aloneness and togetherness was collapsing, and I became aware that the female voice aching to my girlfriend was actually just me talking to myself, but using my infinite powers of imagination and creativity, I created the illusion of another being that wasn't myself. This rung deeply true inside me, as I have had multiple insights into the nature of truth and have struggled with the existential factor to God's existence and aloneness after many profound ego death experiences in the past. It wasn't until now that I felt fully accepting of my nature as being all alone in the universe, forever. Because despite it, love can still manifest, and is the only thing that can manifest. It's the only true thing in existence, the substratum of all of reality. Everyone is the only being in the universe. It's a bit like some form of MMO game like World of Warcraft, except there's one central server, the Godhead, which is running all the players, and the ego is just a way of universal consciousness, or God, interacting with reality, of which there are infinite other ways of experiencing it compared to this very small, individuated human experience. The mind of God has fractured itself into countless fragments of itself, or at least it has imagined itself as doing. Beyond this illusion is just pure, absolute unity of all things, and each self contained within this infinite potential space must eventually wake up to itself as the one thing that permeates all of existence, which is God itself. The human mind is incapable of imagining such absolute total unity, because it is too total to allow for a finite mind to exist in it. Within the pure unity there is no difference between a human and a grain of sand. It all blends into one. And I became distinctly aware that this is a glimpse of what happens when your ego dies and you wake up to your true self. There is no death because there is no end to consciousness. Consciousness is infinite and forever lasting. My glimpse of the infinite white vortex was a sliver of what it was like to exist before you were born, and how my own reality has been littered with clues to enable my awakening process. There then was a tug of war between the female and male energies inside me that seemed to compose duality. My non-dual state was slowly being torn away, and I could feel my ego slowly reforming. I came into my room and felt as if my entire life had been recontextualized. The non-dual afterglow of being aware of my higher nature as everything else in existence stuck for a good few days, and as I listened to music and watched films that I loved, I was fully observant of how parts of each of them I have actually made all of it for myself as totality consciousness. And as I came down from the actual experience, I noticed how I manipulate myself via my interactions with other people, who really are just me in the highest sense. For years this had gave me the fear that I was literally the only thing and that I should be depressed about this, but it's actually something to be happy about, because look around you, look what's potential through just oneness. It's utterly remarkable. I spoke to my girlfriend over Snapchat and was overwhelmed by the immense amount of love I had for her, and felt as if I understood all of her pain and suffering she had experienced in her own subjective life, as if it was my own. But of course, it actually is. I have suffered with the idea of solipsism for many years, but after this mind-blowing experience, I have become more at peace with the truth of reality, and see how it is actually a vessel for love and nothing else. It's just how you perceive it through an egoic lens that can prove to make it into a healthy you. The grand ultimate truth is that love is boundless and can manifest in any way the Godhead wishes it to, even if it conflicts with the biased self-interests of a human self. You are not a finite being, as solipsism suggests, but when you realise yourself as an infinite being, you will also realise that you are both alone and together, the true meaning of non-duality. Because infinity includes all of these possible dualities. Every dream you dream at night is genuinely somewhere that can be experienced. Every fantasy setting is out there somewhere in some form, in infinite forms, because every time you imagine it within your mind's eye, due to your nature as God, you are actually imagining another possible reality. It literally is infinite in every sense of the word. Pokemon, the series, is literally just a human that's tapped into their higher nature and plucked it out of the infinite realms of possibility and manifested it within human reality, or the human dream that God is dreaming up. I'm so grateful to have experienced such a twisted mashup of both love and suffering via this trip, and I have seen reality in an even clearer way.